Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. We are in the final week of the course and we have been in this week talking about cognitive development. So, in the last lecture I talked to you about different aspects of development, different fundamental questions that have been asked about development, the nature versus nurture debate. I spent a lot of time talking about how the nature aspect of the whole equation really works out. What is genes, heredity, how do things transmit from one generation to the other, what are the kind of genetic disorders that might be there, what are the kind of other prenatal influences like the influences of drugs and alcohol on the developing child. So, in today's lecture I'll take this discussion a little bit further. We have talked about the prenatal aspect of things in much detail, but let us now talk about how is the newborn born with, what are the abilities that a newborn is coming with, and how do these abilities develop in the course of the life. Now, I am kind of going to talk about these different aspects. So, let us begin with the perceptual processes. Let us begin with vision. Newborns have poor visual acuity. Okay, their ability to change focus is very limited and they are very nearsighted. So, for example, children who are just 1.5 months old, they generally the furthest they can see is very close, up to 10, 15, 20 centimeters. So, also the other aspect is that they have very poor visual acuity. You can actually look at this figure here. This is basically a kind of mirroring what kind of resolution that the newborn is really looking at on the so the slightly blurred picture is what actually the newborn is really getting, and the visual acuity, the resolution, you can actually think of visual acuity in terms of resolution. The resolution that the child has with respect to whatever he is seeing in the world is slightly poorer. By 7 to 8 months, infant's visual acuity is close to that of adults. So, it takes around 7 to 8 months for the child to actually go from a slightly hazy, slightly blurry vision to more clear, to to the proper vision that adults have. Now, newborns spend a lot of time actively looking around, and this is something, so a lot of these things I am talking about, you can actually observe them yourself. You can actually observe them when you are actually you can actually observe how children are behaving and by being around them. So, newborns, if you see, they spend a lot of time actively looking around. They are interacting with their environment. So, they scan the world in a rather organized way. So, they are not really randomly just moving their heads and looking around the world. They are actually scanning the world in a very organized manner. And say, for example, if there is something that catches their attention, they would pause. If they will try and analyze that, so that when the eyes encounter an object or some change in the visual field, they will orient towards it and they will kind of try and understand what has really happened. So, it is not like they are just here and they are just passively receiving the environment, they are actively interacting with the environment. And this interaction becomes very interesting. Say, for example, when the child is just a newborn, a month and a half old, to when the child is got full visual acuity by 7-8 months, and then what are the kind of sense that the child is making later. Newborns are particularly attracted to areas of high contrast, such as the edges of an object. Say, for example, when the child is looking at particular objects, is more intrigued by the edging part, because say, for example, you are looking at a surface and then there is an edge, there is a vast contrast difference between these two parts. So, the edges are regions of high contrast. You can actually in the surface a different kind of structure is there, and as the surface ends the different kind of structure is there. So, this is something which the child kind of gets attracted to a lot. Now, evidence suggests that newborns display what is referred to as facial preference. Okay, so they like to look at faces. They have this inborn, innate preference for faces as compared to other kinds of visual stimuli. So, children, you would see, they will be more interested in looking at people's faces as compared to, and when they are very young children, as compared to other objects and other visual stimuli that might be available. Also, they would prefer looking at a normal face much more than a scrambled or a blank face. So, if you try and show them scrambled face pictures or something like that, they will not really grasp their attention. Also, one of the things is they would prefer looking at happy faces over fearful or angry faces. So, that is also something that the child is born with. So, this preference for happy faces is there when you are talking about the child. Now, brains of newborns are oriented towards obtaining information from faces. One of the things is that this is something which is evolutionarily also useful. So, brains of newborns are supposed to be oriented towards obtaining information from faces, suggesting that they come equipped to, suggesting that they come equipped to perceive the basic features of faces, the eyes, nose, mouth, also some emotional information that might be there in the faces. And the child is always trying to learn through whatever he is looking at, learn through the faces dynamically, understanding the person's expressions, reacting and learning also two things. So, for example, when the child is looking at the face, the child is doing at least two things. A is that the child is trying to understand the emotional information in the facial expression. Also, one of the things could be that the child is trying to learn to reciprocate those emotions as well. Say, for example, and I was probably talking about this in some other lecture, is that one of the things that a child learns to do is smile, for example, or being angry for that matter. Partly could be innate, but partly is also learned from looking at how people behave when they have to how people turn their faces when they are displaying particular kinds of emotions. So, that is a very interesting thing. That is one of the reasons why it might be evolutionarily important for the child to look at the faces more carefully, because that's kind of could have survival value to it. Also, the child kind of is learning its first impressions of social communication, its first aspects of learning how to behave in the world by looking at faces. They are certainly the most important visual stimuli that the child is coming across. Now, brains of newborns, as I was saying, brains of newborns are oriented towards obtaining these various kinds of information from the faces, suggesting that they are kind of equipped to perceive these basic faces features and also learn through them. Now, let us move to the hearing part, auditory part. Even 26 to 28 week old infants move in response to sharp sounds. So, if there is a sharp sound, the infant would kind of get startled, look around and maybe move in response to that sound. Newborn infants turn their head towards the source of the sound. So, as soon as they develop the control of the neck, they can orient their heads towards the where the sound is coming from. By around 4 months of age, infants starts reaching towards the source of sound in the dark. Suppose, for example, if there is somebody calling out the child, even though it is dark and the child cannot really see the person, the child would try and move towards the source of the sound. They are trying to localize the sound by moving towards it. This helps infants to learn what kind of objects go with what kind of sounds. Say, for example, it might be very useful in recognizing the voices of people around the child, the first caregivers, the parents, the siblings, maybe the relatives, and so on and so forth. Now, newborns, they show a preference for their mother's voice over a stranger's voice, and they even show a preference for stories that their mothers have told, their stories their mothers have recited during the last weeks of pregnancy. Now, this is also something which I am sure you might remember from the lectures on language acquisition when we were doing those I think in the 3rd week. Now, this is something that the child is kind of, and hearing, by the way, is something very, very important for the sense of, for the ability of language, for the cognitive function of language to develop. So, hearing is very closely tied to that. You must remember, we've talked about these things when you're talking about child language acquisition, things like across cultures. That's also very important. Across cultures, adults speak to young infants in very peculiar ways. You remember, I've been talking about infant directed speech or motherese. They will talk in a way that is highly exaggerated. They will talk in a way that has too many loud noises. They'll have too many very well defined spaces or pauses, which will help the child to grasp aspects about human speech. So, a good proper and a very receptive auditory function is very much required for the child to be able to learn language. That is one of the reasons, by the way, why children who are congenitally deaf might have it slightly difficult in learning speaking and language. Moving further, infants as young as 6 months of age are also able to they can distinguish or discriminate between intonations of voice indicating approval and disapproval. So, for example, if you are kind of praising the child, a lot of times people talk to children in funny ways. Suppose they are kind of appreciating something that the child did, or suppose they are kind of trying to in a play sort of way scold the child that you should not do this. So children as young as around 6-7 months of age, they start understanding these intonations, they start understanding whether I have been praised or whether I am scolded at this moment. And this is very fascinating, again something that has to do with the child having the superior ability to process prosodic characteristics of speech. So they will smile more in response to approval intonations, and they'll smile, they'll less, and they'll kind of try and avoid, get unhappy, start crying when the disapproval intonation is presented, even when this is presented in a language different from their own. So this is not really about them having learned language by this time, they have not really learned language of words or anything, but they have just kind of started appreciating the intonations that are there. So again, I am not really talking about them having learned the language, but it is just that the prosodic characteristics are giving certain kinds of valuable information to the child, which the child is processing and kind of manipulating its own behavior in response to these auditory information. Let us move to something else. Let us talk about taste and smell. Infants can discriminate tastes very shortly after birth. They prefer sweet tasting liquids over liquids that are salty, bitter, sour or bland. Newborns can also distinguish between odors. They turn their heads towards sweet smells, and their heart rate and respiration slows down, indicating enhanced attention to these sweet odors that they are more tuned to get. Noxious odors on the other hand, such as those of ammonia or rotten eggs or those kind of things, will cause the children to turn their heads away from there, and their heart rate and their respiration rates generally accelerate, indicating distress and indicating the fact that they want to avoid these smells. So they can already show by these physiological manifestations whether they are preferring a particular odor or they are not preferring that particular odor. Also, infants are able to discriminate very well among subtle differences in smells. There seems to be an innate preference for the odor of mother's milk. So one of the things that I was reading actually talks about the fact that children start getting the sense of the mother's body, they start getting this scent of the mother's milk, and this is something they would say, for example, if you kind of dip a cloth in the mother's milk and if you kind of move it around the child, you will see that the child kind of attends, reacts to that odor very favorably and kind of tries to orient itself towards that odor. That could be one of the evolutionary things that have been built up in the child, because these are the things that are necessary for the child's survival, for proper feeding and these kind of things. As I was saying, this may have an adaptive and also about these odor things. So these things may have an adaptive value which would help infants avoid noxious substances and thereby increasing the chances of survival. Typically noxious odors and bad taste is kind of closely related to things like, say for example, imagine the time when we were living in jungles, the pre-evolution era. It's very common that if you are in the jungle, things that taste extremely bitter might be poisonous, things that kind of smell very bad might be spoiled food, and you don't really want to eat it because if you ingest it you might die of food poisoning. Now this enhance the sense of this extremely developed sense of both taste and smell is in that sense having a lot of evolutionary value, that it has a lot of adaptive or survival value. Now let us talk about a different kind of ability. Let us talk about motor abilities. Now motor abilities basically refer to the stages in which children acquire these motor skills, and these are sequential stages which all the infants pass through as they acquire the muscular control necessary for making coordinated movement. So they basically need to get that kind of muscular control developed in order to start moving their hands, in order to start moving their neck, the lower limbs, their torso for that matter. Now the development of early motor skills, once the child is born, generally is supposed to follow two kinds of rules. I will just refer to these rules briefly. The proximodistal principle basically says that parts that are closer to the center of the infant's body, that is the torso, will the movement or the control of them comes much earlier in parts away from the body. So activities involving the trunk are mastered first, before they can actually start moving their arms and legs, or they start getting a control over their arms and legs. The other principle that is important is the cephalocaudal principle. Now the cephalocaudal principle says that parts of the body that are closer to the head develop before or develop better control before the parts of the body that are farther from the head. So again, the first thing that the child starts to move other than the trunk is the neck. Again, the limbs part basically comes slightly later. So infants, they can kind of lift their heads before they can start controlling their trunks. Again, so it's kind of two principles that are governing the early development. This is a chart basically borrowed from Atkinson Hilgard's book, Susan Nolan Hoeksma's book, and this kind of shows the chronology or the pattern with which the child is acquiring the motor skills. So you can see that by the amount of 2.5 to 4.5 months, children children can roll over. They've developed the control of the trunk. Months later, the child can kind of it can bear some weight on legs. You start if you hold the child, it can kind of start putting the legs in a particular fashion. Move a little bit more, move to 5 and 8 months, the child can start sitting without support. Move to close to starting from 5 to 9 to 10 months, the child can stand up holding to furniture, and so on and so forth. So again, you will see that these milestones which I am referring to are not kind of situated at just one age point. They are not situated in just 1 month. They kind of span. Say for example, rolling over is can happen anywhere between 2.5 to 5 months, or say for example, sitting without support can happen anywhere between 5 months to 10 months. Now this is basically the standard deviation with respect to which these abilities might be achieved by different children, depending on other kinds of environmental and physical, nutritional and environmental features. But if the child is kind of missing this, then there is there can be a talk of whether the child has missed that developmental milestone. Okay. Now let us move slightly further. Let us start talking about some other aspects of development. Begin with talking about cognitive development, and one of the most influential theorists who have talked about cognitive development was the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. And for those people who have done any course in psychology earlier, even if you've done first year course in psychology, or if you've just held a book of Introduction to Psychology in your hands, you will find Jean Piaget's name there. And Jean Piaget is one of the persons who has extensively worked over he is kind of worked by observing children over long periods of time, and he's kind of worked over different aspects of children's development. I'll talk to you about Piaget's work today. Now Jean Piaget basically he focused on the interaction between the child's naturally maturing abilities, the biological part that we have been talking about, and also his or her interactions with the environment. Say for example, when the child is growing up, see for example, we are talking about the motor development part. At different ages, when the child is acquiring these different motor skills, the nature of the child's interaction with the environment also changes, till the point that the child can only roll over, the child can only reach out to particular places, and the entire thing is just limited to that. By the time that the child starts controlling limbs, the child can reach out to things, hold things, etc. By the time that the child has started to stand, then or started to walk, then the scope of activity completely changes. Also, during these interactions, the child is learning a lot about the world. The child is and I'll kind of elaborate on that in a bit. Piaget basically, and the whole point of the example that I was giving was that Piaget basically sees the child, he views the child as an active participant in his environment. The child is an active participant in his environment, and is also an active role player in the entire developmental process. It's not that the child is just a passive recipient of whatever biological development is happening, and whatever the external stimuli are teaching the child. So according to Piaget, and that's a very interesting thought, children are inquiring scientists who are constantly experimenting with objects and events in their environment. You will see when children are growing up, they'll say for example, they'll do a lot of hit and trial. They'll do something, observe very keenly what is happening, how is the environment changing. Suppose for example you touch something, if you touch something, you like the texture, you will touch it again and again. Furry objects, soft objects that children develop a likeness to. Or if the child touches a texture that is slightly uncomfortable, it's thorny, pricky or something like that, the child will not try and touch it again. The child learns, okay, this is a texture that I can prefer, this is a texture that I would not prefer. Now Piaget says that these experiments or interactions that the child is carrying out, these are used to construct what are called schemas. Now schemas are small schemes, they are small theories about the world, about how this works. Don't touch the cup, it is hot. Don't do touch the soft toy because it is soft and you like it. So these kind of schemas are developed, and they are being developed constantly as the child is growing up. They are basically coming from the interaction of the child with the environment. So it's not like somebody is coming and telling the child, it's not coming from the God given thing that these things you're going to prefer, these things you're not going to prefer. It's basically coming out from the child's interaction itself. Now upon encountering a novel object or a novel event, if something is done, what will happen, or a novel object, how do I interact with this object? The child attempts to assimilate it, that is understand it in terms of a pre-existing schema. So for example, it could be a case of a child, say for example, child has a pet at home and the child kind of pats his pet, plays with his pet, and gains some information about, okay, so dogs, say for example dog, if the child has a pet dog, the child would know, okay, dogs are harmless creatures and it's fine to pet dogs, hold their tail, move around with the dog, etc., etc. But if the child kind of comes across a new object, a different kind of a dog, it goes to someplace else and kind of encounters a different dog. Now what would happen is that the child will try and say, acha, this is a dog, this probably is very similar to the dog I have at home. So it's kind of trying to understand it in terms of a pre-existing schema. For the most part, it could turn out in the same way. The dog also responds back, plays, and you kind of start developing a theory about how to interact with dogs. Now Piaget said that if the new experience does not fit the existing schema, what the child will do is it will engage in what is called accommodation. Accommodation basically is modifying a schema to fit new information, thereby extending the child's theory of the world. This is what happens in the world, and the child is constantly doing these experiments and gaining or kind of garnering evidence in order to move ahead in life. So for example, the child knows that dogs are friendly creatures, they can be patted, they can be moved around, and their tail can be held, etc., etc. But then the child goes outside and is kind of trying to do the same to a stray dog, or trying to do the same to a dog that that's probably not as friendly as the dogs that child is known. Now what will happen is that the child will learn the fact that, okay, not all dogs are needed to be petted. If the dog kind of barks or kind of growls to the child will anyways get afraid, start crying, get back and make a note, mental note, that okay, this is not what is supposed to be done. So you cannot pet all dogs. You can actually very easily fit this example that I was trying to make, assimilation and accommodation, to things like, say for example, the child is reaching out for a cup, the cup has hot milk, and then the child learns, accommodates that not all cups need to be touched, because you need to wait and check whether the liquid there is hot or not. So these are some of the things. There are some examples which can demonstrate what Piaget was really thinking and how Piaget was viewing this process of development. Now Piaget was basically, before he became his own person and became his own, started his own individual work, he was working as a intelligence tester. You might have heard of the name of Alfred Binet, who was designed the famous intelligence scales. So he was working as an intelligence tester for Alfred Binet, and what he used to do was he used to get these children, conduct these intelligence tests on them, and then one of the things he wondered a lot was, why are these children making errors, what kind of errors they are making, what kind of ways that they can be actually taught not to do these errors. So he was convinced during his experience being an intelligence tester is that children's ability to think and reason progresses through a series of qualitatively distinct stages. So he thought that this cognitive development, this development of intelligence, is basically going through a variety of qualitatively distinct stages. In one stage something else is happening, in the other one something else is happening, and so on. So he divided this cognitive development of the child into 4 major stages. So I'll just talk to you briefly about what these stages are, and there could be some stages, sub stages as well. So the first stage that Piaget basically talks about, again the first year of the child is the the sensory motor stage. During this stage, the infants interact with and learn about their environment, be it about dogs or hot cups and stuff like that. They kind of are gaining more and more information about the environment by relating their sensory experiences to their actions. Okay, I like to touch this, I'll touch this again and again till there is a reason not to do it. Okay, so what they are doing is they are interacting with their environment using their limbs, using their physical senses, and the kind of the experience that they are getting is determining whether their actions will continue or they will change. So this is the sensory motor stage. Movement and sensory interactions are involved. Now during this stage there are interesting things that the child cannot do, things like object permanence. Now object permanence basically refers to the understanding that objects or events continue to exist even if they cannot no longer be interacted with. Suppose this is again something that a lot of people do with children. You show them a toy and then you hide the toy behind your back. You will notice that very young children stop searching for the toy as soon as you kind of take it away from them. One of the reasons that Piaget said is that children have not really developed this concept of object permanence. Very young children in the first stage of development, they do not really have this concept. If the object is not perceptible, it is not there for them to see, they would not have the sense of that object still exists, because if once they develop this sense that this object still exists, they will try to look for and search for the object, and they will try to ask you to bring that object because they know that it is there somewhere, and you will see how this behavior changes when the child is growing up. Now, so this concept of object permanence develops slowly over a period of about 9 months, and by the end of the sensory motor stage, an infant will now start searching for the object. They will start looking for the lost, disappeared objects, indicating that this sense of object permanence is now fully developed. You can see this example here again from Nolan Hoeksma's book, that if you hide the toy using a particular kind of a screen, the child is not really looking for the toy anymore, because there is no sense that this object actually exists more than there. The next stage is the pre-operational stage. The pre-operational stage is the second of Piaget's developmental stages. During this stage, children start learning to use using symbols such as words or mental images to solve problems. So there are two kinds of interesting problems that Piaget gave the children to solve and kind of thought how they are going to develop this. First is this problem of conservation. Now conservation basically refers to the fact that even though the shape of some object or substance is changed, the total amount remains the same. Suppose for example I am kind of lined up 5 things. I will show you the example now. The concept of conservation. Suppose here you look, there are 3 glasses. You can see that the amount of the liquid is the same when you look at the shorter glasses, but if you kind of put liquid from one of the glasses into this taller but more slender glass, the level will rise up. Then when you ask this 4-year-old child that which of these things, which of these glasses hold more liquid, the child is just going to look at the level and tell you that the taller and slender glass has more liquid, even though already you have seen that this is the same amount of liquid across the. So this concept of conservation is not there. Another example again borrowed from Nolan Hoeksma's book. You see here that you can see, for example, the when 2 lines of these kind of plastic coins there, and you kind of asking the children that which of the 2 lines has more coins. In the first instance, the child is kind of confused because it is obviously the same number of coins and there are no structural differences. But if you look at the next picture, you have just put the coins, the red coins, in a more spaced manner, and that is basically what is and when you ask the child the same question again, then the child says there are more red coins than the black coins. So again, this is something that conservation of number is it's really not there. Children under age 6 or 7 would say that the original thing now contains, the black one now contains fewer coins. One of the other important aspects of the pre-operational stage is this aspect of egocentric thinking. Now, egocentric thinking basically refers to the fact, it refers to seeing and thinking of the world only from your own viewpoint and having difficulty appreciating, from someone else's point of view. So, the idea is children, young children basically have this aspect that they kind of cannot understand the other person's point of view. Okay. Say for example, if you ask the child that, if, and there is a very neat experiment that Piaget or you will find that in demonstrations, there are two mountains you draw to the child and you place the child towards the smaller mountain and you are towards the lower mountain. If you ask the child that, which one of the two is bigger, and say suppose for example that one is kind of seeming bigger to the child will continue saying that that one is bigger. If you ask the child that, what is bigger for me, the child will not be able to correctly answer this question, because at this stage children have not really acquired the ability to think about what others might be seeing and looking the world as. I will talk about this is a very interesting aspect of cognitive development. We will talk about that very shortly in more detail. The third stage of cognitive development as per Piaget was concrete operational stage. Now, the concrete operational stage is the third stage, and during this stage children can, they can start performing a number of logical mental operations and dealing with concrete objects. Now, this is the time that the child kind of grasps this concept of classification. So, two things made from the same material into different shapes can be kind of, recognized as same. They will have this understanding there. Classification, children can now classify material using categories such as shape and color. Suppose you give children different kinds of shapes in a basket and ask them to put all triangles together and all circles together, they will start doing these kind of things at this stage. Now, the fourth and the final stage of Piaget's cognitive development theory is the formal operation stage. This is from young, around a very young age to young adulthood. During this stage, adolescents, and I am talking about adolescents here. So, during this stage, adolescents and adults develop the ability to think about and solve abstract problems in a more logical manner. Okay. In this formal operation stage, the children will learn to solve abstract problems in a systematical manner. They can be asked questions about good, bad, right, wrong, those kind of things. So, all of these basic biological and other conceptual developments have happened. Now, the child can start appreciating abstract things, happiness, sadness. Earlier it is just about, if there is a desired outcome, the child is happy. If there is undesired outcome, the child is sad. But at this stage, formal operation stage, the child is starting to grasp more abstract concepts, things, that things can be right or wrong, good or bad, those kind of things. Those appreciation of those concepts are there. Now, let us talk a little bit about, criticisms of Piaget's theory. So, there are some of the major criticisms of Piaget's theory. Say for example, while Piaget's theory was a major milestone in developmental psychology, newer methods that followed him, newer methods that kind of brought to them new ways of testing in the intellectual abilities of the child, they showed that Piaget probably underestimated children's abilities. Say for example, this case of object permanence, it was shown that Piaget underestimated the children's abilities regarding the same. So, he said that object permanence is not developed until the end of the sensory motor stage by around 8 to 9 months, but newer methods, newer testing methods have shown that these kind of things or hints of object permanence ability start happening much earlier than what Piaget estimated. So, that is one. Also, if you look at Piaget's developmental stages, and as he is kind of said, these are not really, development does not really happen in such a rigid ways, so these stages are not really found to be as rigid as he had originally proposed them. For example, pre-operational children can also start solving some abstract problems such as taller or shorter comparisons, as because Piaget supposed that this will happen slightly later, but even he would say that these things would happen only in the concrete operation stage, but it has been shown with newer testing methods and with different ways of looking at how children perform that some of these operations, that again as object permanence I was saying, some of these things might be happening slightly earlier than what Piaget would have estimated. Another, and this is the major aspect why I think that this theory's Piaget's theory falls short, is that This is a theory that talks more about description than explanation. So if you look at how Piaget kind of draws the this typology of development, draws this whole sequence thing, these stages are more descriptive in nature. They will tell you what the child will be able to do in this stage, what the child will be able to do in this stage, and what the child will be able to do in the third stage. But the idea is that Piaget does not really talk at length about how and why these things are happening at these stages. He is not really attempting to answer the causality question. He is not attempting to answer how these processes are happening, when they are happening, and in what manner. So that is again these three of the points that I have pointed out, four of the points could be valid criticisms of Piaget, but again certainly this is one of the most influential theories of cognitive development of children that we have, and it's one of the earliest such broad theories of development, and in that sense it kind of deserves adequate credit and adequate praise. Now ever since that time a lot of alternatives to Piaget's theory of development have been offered. Things like developmental psychologists generally agree that Piaget must have underestimated children's ability, and that his theory has been and can be challenged on so many different grounds, but they have kind of come up with different alternatives, and not all of them have really worked out so well. So first kind of alternative that comes up in response to Piaget's theory of development is coming from the information processing approaches. Now information processing approaches basically believe that children are good at gathering specific skills, and they are basically learning to analyze specific information coming from the environment and react accordingly. So they think that the standard Piagetian task, and one of the things they emphasize is that the standard Piagetian task, conservation of number, object permanence, those kind of things, they fail to separate the skills from the skill that the task is supposed to assess. They were saying that a lot of things that Piaget was asking these children to do could be done by so many different skills. So the explanation could be could be varied, and in that sense it does not really tease apart the skill that you are actually focusing at. So this is one of the things that they point out, and so they are saying is that you should look at development as the process of gathering and analyzing information. So children's development is more about them collecting information from the environment and analyzing that information and reacting accordingly. Another point of disagreement, there is this disagreement between the information theorists, information processing theorists, is that whether development should be understood as a series of consecutive qualitatively distinct stages, or you could look at development as a continuous process, as a continuous process of change. So because Piaget is kind of putting these rigid boundaries, all of this happens in this stage, all of this happens in the second, all of this happens in the third and the fourth stages. Now the information processing approaches basically say that all of this is a cumulative process. Say for example, if the child develops a particular skill, that development of that skill might be a cumulative outcome of whatever information processing things that the child has learned over the years. A good example for that is this development of language. When the child has said its first word, it's not that suddenly at a particular age the child kind of starts speaking. You have seen in the language acquisition chapter that there are so many abilities starting from 3 months before the child is actually born. There are so many things that the child is acquiring: prosodic appreciation, the distinction between speech and non-speech sounds, the non-native contrast, the preference for a native language. So many things that the child is learning, and then at a particular age 1.5 2 years the child speaks the first word. So this is one of the, it's kindly a more tenable approach when you're talking about development. The other kinds of approaches that have come across are referred to as the knowledge acquisition approaches. So knowledge acquisition approaches basically, so some researchers assume that the only difference between children and adults is that adults have a more extensive knowledge base. Okay, they have a larger collection of facts, they know a lot more about the world, but they also have a deeper understanding about how facts in a particular domain are organized. So the adults know that how things function, but why they are functioning like that is also what the adults have, and children basically have to kind of gain both these pieces of information. An example of a knowledge acquisition approach is Siegler's overlapping waves theory of cognitive development. So, according to Siegler's theory, children have access to multiple ways of solving problems at any one time, but with age and experience, some strategies become more frequent while others become less frequent. Now, this is something you can observe in children, that their behavior and their way of interacting with the environment changes with age. Okay, so they might say, for example, to get food from the mother, the earlier thing was that you just cry and your food is noticed, and your demand is noticed and you're given. Later you can just ask for it and stuff like that, and later you can develop more nuanced ways to ask for the same thing. So these strategies basically these change over time, and these reflect how children are acquiring this knowledge and interacting with the environment. They get this better and more specified theories about how things work in this world. Now, the difference between facts and organization was demonstrated in a study where there were 10-year-old chess experts, so children who were very good at playing chess, and they kind of were competing with college students who are amateurs at chess, but obviously they are college students, they have more mental ability and you will expect them to do better. Now, when they were asked to memorize and recall lists of random numbers, the college students obviously outperformed the 10-year-olds. But when they were tested on their ability to recall the actual positions of the chess pieces, the 10-year-olds did it much better as compared to the 18-year-olds. So, as far as just the fact part, just the raw ability part was concerned, obviously the 18-year-olds could do it better, but when organization of this material is there, then these people, the 10-year-old children who have had more practice with chess, they obviously outperformed the 18-year-old chess amateurs. So, this kind of demonstrates this distinction between an approach which is basically resting of facts, but not only on facts but organization of these factual knowledge as well. Now, we can move to socio-cultural approaches. So, children's intelligence does not really develop or flower in isolation. Okay, it always is happening in response and in context of a particular situation. So, while Piaget was emphasizing children's interaction with the environment he was talking about was the physical environment. Okay, this one is kind of ignoring the cultural context largely, but other approaches, the socio-cultural context view of cognitive development, it says that the child should not really be seen only as a physical scientist, but also as a newcomer to a culture. Say for example, you are born in a African family, or you are born in an American family, or you are born in Indian family. Within India there are so many different cultures that are there, whether you are born to a Punjabi family or or a Tamil family or a Kashmiri family, things like that. So, the child has to also be seen as a newcomer to a particular culture, and other than what cognitive intellectual development the child will be doing, he will also be learning how the culture operates, and that is a very important aspect, and the culture interacts with the kind of intelligence that the child is developing. So, this is something. So, children are also seeking to become a native by learning how to look at social reality through the lens of that culture. In my culture this is happening, and you will see children kind of pick up these aspects of their culture almost automatically. So, cultural influences upon children's cognitive development can manifest in a variety of ways. Children learn by observation, experience, or at least sometimes by hearing about an activity. A good example could be, say for example, if you talk about people living in the Kalahari desert, water is very scarce. Okay, so if you try and teach them this the concept of conservation by this the glass experiment example that I was showing you recently, they might not really be able to learn that. But does that mean that these children are intellectually underdeveloped or they are challenged or something? Maybe not. They have their own special set of skills. For example, they can at even that particular age can succeed in finding and looking for water bearing roots, because water is scarce. You have to find any source of water that might be there. So, that is also the kind of intelligence that is more culturally entrenched, that is more situated within the context that the child is living in, and that also needs to be emphasized adequately. Now, culture it might help in deciding the the frequency of certain activities. For example, traditional dancing is very common in the Balinese culture. So children in the born and brought up in Bali might be very good at traditional dancing and those kind of things. They pick up very quickly. But say for example in Norway, the culture involves a lot of skiing. There's a lot of ice. It involves a lot of skiing and skating. So same age children here might develop skiing and skating a lot more than traditional dancing. So you will see you cannot really say that this one is more cognitively complex, this one is more cognitively simpler. Both are physical activities, both are basically within the cultural context that the child is born into, and children kind of grasp them accordingly. Culture also determines how children will relate to particular activities. For example, children born in particular cultures where pottery is considered important, they will actually associate learning pottery as a very important function. They will interact with their parents, they will contribute to making pots, and they will basically end up maybe selling pots in the market. And that's a very important social economic activity that the child is mastering at at a very early age. In cultures, say for example, or in privileged cultures for that matter, where making pottery is just a hobby course, children will not really attach that much importance to pottery. So these people, the former people for whom making pots is a part of their earning their livelihood, it's part of their social interaction, they will learn pottery making in much more nuanced ways as compared to these people for whom pottery is just a hobby that you kind of learn to do, and pass it off as just a socially useful productive work kind of thing, or just a nursery school pastime. So you can see how these how the culture is playing a role in just differentiating these different aspects of skill acquisition. By contrasting the child's role in the activity, also culture tells us a lot about how children will pick up something. For example, in particular cultures, meat is obtained in the supermarket, and children and adults really have no part in getting the meat to the table. They just go to the supermarket, pick up the frozen meat, pay the money, and they are fine with it. But in some other cultures, say for example tribal cultures, etc., the meat basically has to be hunted. It has to be basically you have to trap the animal, kill the animal, prepare the animal. That is the entire aspect of eating meat has all of these 3 or 4 steps. So for them, getting meat on the table is a much richer activity as compared to a culture where just you have to go to the supermarket, buy the meat from the freezer and pay and come back. So different activities, how much the child is involved in a particular activity will also kind of determine how much what kind of intelligence, what kind of skill set, what kind of understanding of those activities that the child will kind of grasp. So this is again something where I am talking about the role of culture. Now these socio-cultural views of development, of cognitive development, basically they borrow largely from the work of this Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky believed that we develop understanding and expertise primarily through what is described as apprenticeship. We are just observing, we are just looking at being guided by the situation that we are in. We are guided by more knowledgeable individuals, and these individuals help us in understanding more and more about our world, and they help us in grasping more and more skills. For children, for that matter, parents are these highly skilled individuals. So children are really getting most of their information from parents. How do they behave, how do they eat, how do they sleep, how do they walk, how do they talk, all of those kind of things children are basically learning as being apprentices in the same things. The child eventually does all of the things that the father or the mother is going to do, all of the things that the child skills are that the child will acquire, but the child is observing through these more knowledgeable, more skilled people all of these aspects. Finally, Vygotsky kind of defined 2 levels of cognitive development. The first is the child's actual level of development, what the child can do at a given point in time, and the child's level of potential development. Say for example, what the child can do when taught and trained to do something. So Vygotsky basically says that if you really want to measure the how the child is developing, you basically need to take into account both the actual development, whatever the actual things that the child can do, and also potential development. You give the child some task, see how you can help him do it, and see how quickly he is picking up that task. So, to talk about a particular child, you have to take into account both of these things, and that will be giving a more better, that will be giving a better measure of the cognitive development, and it will help you provide appropriate instruction to the child. Okay. Vygotsky reviewed language as central to cognitive development. He says that language plays a very important role in developing the new skills and knowledge. Language is actually one of the things that as we have talked about in this entire course, that it plays a role in understanding thoughts, it plays a role in communicating, expressing, all those kind of things. And so according to Vygotsky, language is one of the central tenets of how cognitive development really goes through. He says that children use their language ability to guide their own actions and to practice the new skill. I mean, that's one of the things that children are constantly using, and that's something that contributes to their overall development. So that's all from my side about cognitive development, and we talked a little bit about how the initial perceptual abilities of the child are, and we'll continue talking about various aspects of development in the next lecture.